Hi everybody, it's Frazer here, and today's guest is Hugo Simpson. Now Hugo, as well as being an old friend of mine, is the founder of Lawton Scott, which is a big communications organisation with clients such as the BBC, Credit Suisse, Network Rail, Sky Sports and Barclays and many more. He also works with some of the UK's leading sports personalities, people like Anthony Joshua. And Hugo has an exciting new venture. He's about to launch an online program aimed at helping individuals speak more confidently, which will therefore enable them to advance their careers. So it's a great pleasure. I welcome my friend, Hugo Simpson. Hugo, how are you?
I think I'm okay. Yeah.
That doesn't sound good, only okay.
Well, it's Friday. This other mad world we're living in, I think I'm okay.
I was actually thinking of putting my name into the hat for Prime Minister just for a day. Just for a day, it'd be great. So I could have £115,000 for the rest of my life.
I read that. It's quite extraordinary, wasn't it? Yeah,
it really is. So anyway, welcome to the podcast. Now I know from talking to you previously, you're about to launch this new online program. What's the purpose of that? Who's it aimed at?
I mean, I think it's aimed at anybody who is aware that perhaps communication, particularly public speaking, presentation skills, interviews, I suppose those more pressurized situations, people who know that they are technically extraordinarily capable, but find the communicating under pressure bit really challenging. As an introvert myself, I suppose I have a particular empathy with introverts who often find that communicating in the spotlight difficult.
It's strange, isn't it? That you are an introvert, and yet I know you went to drama school and you've built two very successful companies. What made you go to drama school if you are naturally introverted?
Well, I was building at the time, and I remember working on a big site, and I was stripping wool, and it was an enormous building, and it was like this rabbit warren of corridors. There was no natural light. And every 5 minutes, the timer would go off. And so I would be up a ladder with a steamer in one hand, sweating, covered in spitting boiling water, scraping off the wallpaper. And then suddenly I would be in complete darkness and have to go and find the switch again. And after about a month of this, I just thought, I can't do this anymore.
So you decided to be an actor instead.
And so the obvious next step was to become an actor. No, my brother and sister and grandparents were actors, and I kind of figured, well, how hard can it be? And how unbelievably wrong I was. It's an incredibly difficult profession to train in.
So how did you cope with having an introverted nature, suddenly being in that sort of environment where you are quite literally center stage in the spotlight?
Yeah, badly, I would say. I think I was the only actor at LAMDA, which is the drama school I went to, who can hand on heart say they hated being on stage for every minute of the 3 years I was there. And I'm often asked that question, and I normally put it down to one thing, and that was just simply not knowing what to do. So the pressure of being on stage in the spotlight, feeling very much out of my comfort zone and out of control, was something that built this sort of internal anxiety. And it was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, because every time I went on stage, that little voice in my head would get louder and louder and just tell me I couldn't do it, or I was going to forget my lines. And so it ended up being something that just became terrifying for me. And
how did you overcome that then?
I mean, I think necessity in a way. I think just by virtue of having to get up there and do it. But I think I don't think I ever produced a performance that I was probably capable of producing at drama school. I mean, it was not something that I ever came to terms with. I think throughout the 3 years, it was just something that I tolerated. The bit that I loved was when the production finished and I could relax, which isn't necessarily what you want, but I just found it intensely stressful.
What lessons did you learn there that now you're able to share those lessons and help other people who also hate being in the spotlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me was learning that in order to be a good communicator, you don't have to feel inherently confident. And so you put me on a stage now, I still don't like being in the spotlight. It's still not my comfort zone. I still much rather be in the periphery, but I've learned how to do it. And I always say to clients, it's not about having to feel inherently confident to come across well. It's simply knowing what to do in the spotlight in order to be able to replicate that natural version of you when you're down at the pub talking to friends on subjects you're passionate about, you're very relaxed. So I would say 95% of being a good communicator is technique.
Okay, so there are learned techniques that you can come across to either fake confidence or actually make yourself confident.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be what's called an ambivert now, which is a sort of mix of extrovert and introvert. I mean, it would be completely disingenuous to say that I still display introvert characteristics. I don't, because I've been doing this for so long, and I've just learned how to feel reasonably comfortable under pressure. But it's very interesting. I am much, much more confident in a work context than I would be in a social situation. A lot of that introvert side of me becomes much more challenging when I'm in a social situation.
Interesting. So why do you think in someone's career, why is it important to be able to have that, project that confidence and speak well in public? Why is it important for people to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I would say, and I often start a training session saying, if the average manager spends 45 minutes of every hour writing or talking, and it's something they struggle with, well, that's an enormous amount of time at work invested in something perhaps not only do we struggle with, but perhaps we're not that good at. And that is likely to have a profound implication on our careers. So whether it's those internal promotions, job opportunities in internal interviews, whether it's having to give a big presentation, whether it's just pure visibility, being in a meeting, having the confidence to talk up, having a voice. So much of our own personal brand is aligned to what we say and what we write. And so often it's those extrovert characters with the big voices who aren't necessarily always particularly proficient in what they do, but end up being noticed.
I think we all know one or two of those, don't we?
We all know one or two of those. And I've come across so many unbelievable personalities who are brilliant, who have the most extraordinary depth of knowledge and insights on subjects, who just sit there suffering in silence because they have a real fear of speaking up.
Yeah, and it's sad, isn't it? Because those people, as you say, are often the most knowledgeable, the most competent, but they kind of hide their light under a bushel, and they never fulfill their potential, and may well look back on their lives with kind of feelings of bitterness and regret that they didn't have the confidence to speak up and share their ideas. So it's quite a major issue for people, I would think.
Yeah, totally. And often, and I'm not blaming organizations, and a lot of the organizations I work in are so good at providing amazing training, but it is amazing how many senior people I work with who have never been put on any sort of communication course, given they spend 75% of their day communicating, and it's you would have thought it was in the interest of the organization to create a culture of great communication, because the benefits are so far-reaching.
I think it was Warren Buffett who said it's the best investment you can ever make. Invest in public speaking skills.
Yeah,
and
well, he did right, didn't he?
Sorry,
I said he did okay for himself.
Well, yeah, he did. He apparently used to throw up when he was at high school. He used to throw up at the thought of having to speak in public, and he really kind of grabbed the bull by the horns and taught him. Went on, I think it was a Dale Carnegie course about public speaking and how to do that. And he's worth $120 million, but he says it's the best investment he has ever made. And he's invested.
Did you say 120 million or billion?
Billion.
Billion. I think I thought for a moment you said million. I think that's you've slightly underplayed his wealth there.
Yeah. No, that's pocket change for Warren.
Yeah, I know. No, absolutely. No, and I think it's really interesting, because often I do a lot of work at sort of exec level, and are the individuals I work with infinitely brighter, more experienced than other folk in the organization? I mean, possibly occasionally, but not necessarily. From my experience, I think the noticeable differentiator is that ability to influence, persuade under enormous pressure with very limited time to prep. They're able to go into those situations and come across consistently at their best and hold a room. And they really work at and understand that those soft skills become correspondingly way more important than those hard skills as their careers progress. And so many people I work with say, I know my career has plateaued because I've found this area of communication so challenging. I've shied away from those situations that I know would have ultimately benefited me.
Yeah, so it really can put a glass ceiling on people's careers that they could actually smash through just by practicing the techniques that you teach, I guess. I mean, on the subject of that, can you just share three very powerful techniques that people can use to appear more confident when they're speaking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you can in simplistic terms break it down into delivery and also content. It's ultimately how you come across, and it's what you say. Mm-hmm. And I would say when it comes to delivery, the most important thing when you're communicating, whether it's online or particularly if it's in front of multiple folk, is understanding the correlation between eye contact and the fight or flight response. And the more we typically scan around looking at lots of people simultaneously, the more likely it is that we activate the part of the brain called the amygdala, which is responsible for triggering the fight or flight response. So as an introvert, when I used to at drama school look out at a sea of people, that's what would trigger the fight or flight response, which would cut off what we call the prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of the brain. So if I'm giving a keynote speech now, what I will always do is just pick out individuals. So I'm only ever looking at one person at a time. Mm-hmm. Because it's a one-on-one, that little amygdala doesn't identify a threat and therefore keeps you in that thinking part of the brain. So whether it's you're talking to 10 people around a table, it's just having what we call mini conversations, little one-to-one conversations, rather than flittering around and looking at everybody simultaneously. So eye contact, I would say, is massively important. The other thing, I suppose, there's many different things in terms of great delivery, but I would say online, because this is so important now. You can see how I've positioned myself, where my chin is pretty much in the middle of the screen. And that's because it's really important to be able to see the person's body language. Just observe. I like the way you shuffle yourself.
I'm emulating that. I'm going to alter my camera. I'm going to put myself.
But it's really interesting. Just observe on Zoom or Teams calls how many people, the bottom of the screen is their chin's almost at the bottom of the screen. So when they're talking, you can't see that body language. Just by moving yourself, you can see that difference. And body language is so important in terms of getting ourselves into the right level of energy. The more nervous we feel, the more we want to make ourselves physically and vocally smaller. So being able to get the body language going, I would say, really important. Third thing, let's move over to content, is applying the two bywords that underpin all great content. And if we apply these two words instantly, we're going to have a really positive impact in terms of people engaging with what we say and certainly remembering and ultimately likely to do what we want them to do. And the first word is relevance. It's not just about what I want to say, it's what my audience needs to hear. So we really have to take the time to understand who is my audience, what's important to them, rather than what's important to me. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but we so rarely think about our audience in advance. The second word is clarity. And often, particularly when we're more junior, we want to demonstrate all our hard work. So we just go, we give our audience everything because we want people to know how hard we've worked and we want to demonstrate the volume of work. Whereas clarity is the English to English translation from your world into a language that your audience understands. So it's about applying the less is more theory. Be really cognizant of not giving too much information. Don't default into speaking in a very formal or writing in a very formal style. Make it conversational. And make sure that you understand keeping it simple doesn't equate to dumbing down. You're just making what you write or say accessible. So those would be my kind of 3 key tips.
Absolutely. Now, I know you did some training for some of my team members a few years ago. And one of the things I remember very clearly about that was, I think you said that, was it 80 or 90% of the message that people hear is your body language rather than the words you say. Why is body language so important, and what should people be thinking of in terms of their body language when they're speaking?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was roughly, I mean, the sort of, I kind of round up figures. It was essentially 10% was content. I mean, it was actually about 7%, but for argument's sake, 10% was content, 60% was body language, and 30% was voice. Now, I think the key message to always get across is it's not saying it's 10% important. This was based on impact, the impact we have. And so ultimately what it was saying was you're going to have somebody who's got great energy, who understands the importance of great body language, finding that lovely color and tonality in the voice, delivering the same message as somebody who looks physically uncomfortable, where there is no body language, is kind of looking down, and the voice becomes very monotone and there's lots of ums, ahs. You can have exactly the same message, but the energized delivery is going to land those messages in a completely different way. So it's always, I always say it's ultimately all about content, but it's understanding that your delivery will have a huge impact on how much or how little your messages land.
Yeah, I remember very clearly that lesson. I remember implementing it in conversations I had in the kind of network meetings or one-to-ones in the kind of days and weeks that followed. And I could noticeably recognized the level of interest in people. They were really engaged with what I was saying and stuff, and we were getting really excited by it. So it definitely works. It made a massive difference, really did.
Well, it's understanding. And this is the fundamental difference between writing in the context of business and talking. The written form is about objectivity. It's about presenting information, often in bullet point form, that provides calm, considered, rational information, if you like. The spoken word is your opportunity to create that emotional connection with the audience. And if you're just giving a version of a written document, you're just listing information, looking and sounding uninspired, like you don't care, then how on earth are we expecting our audience to give a monkey's either? So I often say it's about finding that appropriate emotional connection. It's not about being emotional. It's just about coming across like you care. And without any body language and a monotone voice, it's almost impossible to do.
Absolutely. You touched on this earlier, the fact that we are all using Zoom for meetings and presentations and online presentations much more. And there are obviously clearly significant differences. I mean, I've got a little bit more comfortable with it, but I found it very difficult, especially when I'm doing webinars, just talking to a camera, excuse me, and not being able to read who I'm talking to, not even knowing if anyone's listening some of the time. I find it's very difficult, to build any sort of rapport. What would you say the main differences are in the techniques you use between speaking with people in person and presenting or holding a meeting with somebody via a webcam? And what can people do to make sure they come across, and perhaps they can build that rapport over a camera? What tips would you give people for that?
Yeah, I mean, again, a great question. I mean, it's a challenge. A lot of it comes down to Frazer behaviors. So, when we started off training online, it was just a given that people would have their cameras on. And then we started noticing during training sessions that all of a sudden people would start turning cameras off. And so I mandated with all my training that unless people turn their cameras on, I'm not going to train them. Because certainly when it comes to communication, if you can't see somebody, I mean, I would say it's a little bit like the equivalent of walking into a meeting and then just climbing under the table. I mean, there would be no point. And we all know back in the old world that conference calls didn't really work. And that's what we're creating, is a culture now where people are abusing online meetings. They're not considering the impact it has for the person presenting if they can't see the person. Now, obviously, if there's 160 people on a call, then you can't expect everyone to have the cameras on. But I ran a communication masterclass the other day, and there were well over 100 people. There wasn't a single person who I could see.
Really?
So, not one single person. And it was really disconcerting because it was a bit glitchy. My internet was going in and out. So I couldn't work out if I'd frozen or not. And every time I sort of say, can everyone see me? I'm just a bit paranoid I've frozen. There was no response. So that's the first thing, is to be brave, put your camera on. The other thing is, so right now it's really tempting to want to talk to you, your video, okay? Because the reality is that's, in my brain, how I'm creating a connection. But right now it probably looks to you like I'm looking away. Now I'm looking into my camera.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, from your perspective, it looks like I'm talking to you, but now I can only see you in my periphery.
Yes.
So the kind of most important thing is to make sure that you look into your camera to create that illusion of eye contact. And then it's really a lot of the same principles about making sure that the body language is visible, that you're really thinking about tonality, pauses, just the usual suspects, so that you're coming across looking and sounding like you want to be there. And I would say again that this is something I cover a lot in my training, is really understanding the importance of great energy.
Absolutely. So that brings me on to the next point. I know you have an absolute loathing of bullet points, well, PowerPoints, but bullet points in particular. Why is that? Why? Because they're the standard way people present. Why have you got such an aversion to them?
Well, I think I don't have an aversion to PowerPoint per se. It's the misuse of PowerPoint that I have a problem with. And what people don't really often understand is the human brain cannot read and listen simultaneously. We simply cannot do it. And so people create these slides with huge amounts of content, and yet it ultimately makes the presenter redundant, because if you're asking me to read something, I'm going to read it. And if I'm reading and I'm not listening, then why are you there? You should just send me an email. So PowerPoint was always ever designed 35 years ago, whenever it was introduced, as a visual aid. You know, a picture paints 1,000 words. I mean, don't try and describe a picture, just put one up, or a graph, or something that adds to what I'm saying. But the minute we just list, all we end up doing is just reading off those bullet points. And what they actually end up becoming is our notes. And I'm not against using notes, but have your notes in front of you, but don't put them up on the slide. And also, it's a way of being able to double up as a handout as well. Well, the problem is, if you give somebody a document that just has a load of bullet points, there's no narrative. So it doesn't work as an independent handout. So it doesn't work as a handout. It doesn't work as a vehicle to be able to present next to. So it's really understanding what PowerPoint's designed for. And I always say, I would abolish the word presentation. I would just, you're just talking to people. I mean, you're either writing to somebody or you're talking. And I just say to people, how would you say that if you were down the pub? We don't go down the pub and pull out a PowerPoint presentation on our holiday.
I do.
I mean, people used to want to get the old pictures out, but we tell stories, and that's a big part of what I teach is the translation from lists into more persuasive stories.
And I remember reading a book by Peter Guber, who's a big cheese in Hollywood, and he's run various billion-dollar companies. He owns football franchise and stuff in America. His book's called, I think, Tell to Win, and it's all about the power of storytelling, and that's how he sealed so many big deals throughout his career. Why do you think storytelling is such an important part of, I was going to say, giving a presentation, or just talking to people? Why is storytelling so important?
Because I think humans worship at the altar of stories. I think they're part of our DNA. For tens, hundreds of thousands of years, we've used stories as a way of passing down information. And it's a combination of, it's incredibly memorable, but also they create those emotional connections. And a great story inspires you to want to know what happens next. If you're on slide 38 of a content-heavy slide, you're not sort of willing the next slide. You're kind of willing the presenter to end it. And people often say to me, "Oh, well, my world's dull." Well, it's dull if you show a dashboard with a load of numbers, but there's always a compelling story that goes alongside how those numbers fit into that narrative. And so stories keep people motivated to want to know what's going to happen next.
Absolutely.
We love stories. I mean, it's films, newspapers, magazines, going to the theatre. We love a great story.
Yeah, absolutely. I watched something on YouTube recently that said women remember things. You remember things more when there's an emotional connection to it, and that's why women remember everything, because they get emotional about everything. Which I think he was delivering it in quite a humorous way. But the point remains the same. If you're emotionally engaged with something, you're going to remember it much more. So, and I think that's why stories work. Because as you say, it is programmed into our DNA. Because of thousands of years of storytelling tradition.
But we also remember things really in two very simple ways, which is visual and emotional. So if you think about, it's interesting for those who can remember, 9/11, I'll often say to people, can you remember where you were when you found out about it? And it is amazing the level of detail people can recall 20 odd years ago,
Absolutely.
and that's because it was such a visual event, but also it had a profound emotional connection. And, and I can't remember much nowadays, but I can remember specific events where there was that visual and emotional connection so strongly, because they land in the right-hand side of our brains where our long-term memory sits.
Absolutely. So I'd just like to talk about charisma for a little bit. Charisma and confidence seem interlinked to me, which we'll talk about in a second, but we often see celebrities or other successful people who everybody regards as being charismatic. Now, is that just something they're born with, or are there techniques you can learn to become more charismatic?
It's an interesting one, charisma, because most folk talking on a subject they're passionate about, as I said earlier, particularly if it's a vaguely, if you're talking about stamp collecting, unless you have a passion for stamp collecting, it's unlikely that that's going to massively emotionally resonate with people. But if there's something somebody is talking about, a subject that they really care about, and it's of interest to the audience, then the chances are anybody can be very charismatic. I think where it becomes problematic and it gets lost in translation is when we go into this very formal, dry style of talking at work. And there was a big piece of research from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland that identified that using stories, increasing your vocal and physical energy can have a profound impact on your ability to be charismatic. And there was also a chap called Sandy Pentland, who was part of MIT in America. And he invented a device that measures charisma. And that sounds a bit far-fetched, sort of sci-fi stuff, but I've actually worn one of Sandy's devices, and it's fascinating because you can put this device around your neck, and if there's a group of you all wearing them, it can work out who are the natural introverts, extroverts in the room, who listens, who does more talking, and it's an extraordinary piece of equipment. So charisma is definitely something we can develop, 100%, I believe.
And why do you think people are drawn to charismatic people? Is it because they exude confidence, because they seem larger than life? What do you think it is?
Well, I think you can be very charismatic and often not a hugely extrovert character. I think it's about a combination of what you say. Often people who are very knowledgeable or very insightful, who might not necessarily say a lot, but when they do, boy, does it have an impact. Mm-hmm. So I think charisma comes in lots of different forms, but I think it's somebody who's prepared to allow that emotional connection. They're not holding back. They're allowing themselves to be that really authentic, engaged version of themselves, And when we talk on a subject with a bit of passion, it's unbelievably persuasive. I remember sat down having dinner with one of our clients, and he was an engineer, and he was brilliant technically, but he was definitely on the introvert spectrum, and he was quite a shy character, but he started talking about sugar and the dangers of sugar. Now, not something at the time I was even aware of, and I remember him saying to me, I honestly believe that in about 10, 15 years, sugar will be almost labeled in the same way that cigarettes and alcohol will be in terms of danger. And he spoke suddenly so knowledgeably and passionately on this subject that I found myself completely absorbed and gave up sugar for about 8 months afterwards.
Really?
Absolutely. It didn't last, unfortunately, because fondness for chocolate got the better of me. But I remember that meal, and I remember suddenly him speaking so unbelievably passionately on this subject in such a phenomenally persuasive way that it had a profound impact on my life.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, actually. Someone talking about the danger of soft drinks, Coca-Cola, for the amount of sugar in them and chemicals in them. And I used to drink like 3 or 4 cans of Pepsi Max a day at the time, and I completely stopped drinking those sorts of drinks, and I don't have milk or sugar in tea or coffee or anything like that either as a result of him. So it's a very, very similar situation.
I mean, I will say that again, there is a correlation I find between people who are natural storytellers and charisma. And even though I would consider myself an introvert, I am an introvert. I've always been a storyteller. I've always enjoyed telling stories.
Okay.
And whether it's in a work context, down the pub, it doesn't matter. I always really gravitated towards stories. So I would say that the people who are natural storytellers tend to be perceived as often more charismatic.
Because they get people's interest, I guess.
Because they get people's interest. Yeah, exactly.
So I was talking to a chap a few weeks ago who talks about emotional intelligence a lot and why it's so important. Do you think emotional intelligence plays an important role in effective communications?
I mean, I don't think I can
overestimate it.
Yeah, overestimate the significance. And the really interesting thing with IQ, it sort of peaks, I think, 17, 18 years old, as far as I can remember. Around that time, our IQ never improves. We can't improve it. EQ is something we can develop for the rest of our lives.
Interesting. And
again, for me, there is something about people who have that, who've bothered to invest that time in self-development, working on themselves, understanding themselves, who become so much more insightful and perceptive and intuitive. And I mean, I think emotional intelligence in business is, I mean, I think it's been definitely far more recognized now as hugely important. But I still think business has a long way to go in terms of really exploring and understanding the value of having people with high EQ in their organization. It's something we should be so embracing.
And how would you describe emotional intelligence, EQ, to? Is it having an empathy for other people, what they may be thinking, understanding them and being able to relate to them? What does it mean, especially when it comes to communications?
I mean, I think empathy is a fundamental element. Yeah. I mean, I think it's also about, for me, it's about curiosity. It's about just being curious, wanting to know about people, wanting to understand what makes people tick, what makes ourselves tick. I mean, it's extraordinary the number of conversations I have with people where they won't ask a single question, but will happily spend 40 minutes talking about themselves.
You're talking about football.
Or talking about football, yeah. I could spend hours probably talking about football, so I'm a bad example of that. But it's that word curiosity, taking a real interest in people, understanding what makes people ticks, being able to recognize things in other people that resonate with who we are, finding those connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone's giving off some sort of energy. Well, I mean, you can be around some people and they can literally bring the whole atmosphere of an occasion or a meeting down. And clearly, if you want to create a positive impact when you're giving a talk, you need to be giving off positive energy. I know I've heard you mention there's a difference between personal energy and performance energy, but what does that actually mean? What are the differences, and what's the best way to create that emotional connection with an audience?
Yeah. So, I mean, personal energy in really simple terms is the energy we give off that is driven by our environment and how we're feeling. So, for example, if I'm delivering a training session and everybody looks pathologically bored or is making it very clear, I mean, fortunately, it doesn't happen often, but making it very clear they don't want to be there. Or perhaps I'm feeling really exhausted, really tired and stressed. Those are things that would typically, often unconsciously impact my energy levels. So if my assumption is people aren't engaged, I will potentially unconsciously mirror that. My energy will drop. So sort of personal energy can be often very erratic. Depending on how we feel, what's happening with our audience, it can very quickly increase or decrease our energy levels. And because humans have what we call mirror neurons, if somebody's energy suddenly drops and they look nervous, uncomfortable, it makes the audience feel a level of discomfort.
Right. Performance
energy isn't performing in terms of being somebody else. It's being 100% authentically you, just learning how to access that version of you at your best. So irrespective of how you're feeling or what's happening with your audience, it's about knowing how to put that brilliant version of you across at all times.
Okay.
And I think that's what happened to me as an actor, because I am what's called an HSP, which is a highly sensitive person, which I only discovered the other day, but there's a whole sort of, there's a huge amount on it, on HSPs, these highly sensitive people. So I would pick up everything. So if the audience wasn't responding in a way that we were used to, that would completely undermine my performance. Or if I suddenly felt very nervous, I'd go into panic mode. So I was constantly, my energy on stage was going up and down and up and down, not necessarily responding to my other actors. So I think it was very unsettling watching me on stage. What I learned now, or what I'm able to do now, is consistently put that version of me across I want my audience to see. So I'm always at that level of energy where I'm looking and sounding in control. It doesn't mean I always feel it. I just know how to access it.
Okay. And this is something you teach as part of your online.
This is a fundamental part of what we teach, is giving very simple tools and techniques to clients to get them and to keep them in that performance energy space. Yeah,
absolutely. So we talked earlier about the tendency of people who are perhaps a little introverted, who are very good at their jobs, but they are reticent about speaking up in a meeting. So they've got that little voice telling them that they're not good enough, or nobody's interested in what they want to say. How do they conquer that and find the confidence to speak up and share their ideas in a meeting?
I'd say it's a combination, really. I think firstly, there's no moment in a meeting where you're suddenly going to go, right, I've developed that confidence to do it. I think there is just a level of forcing yourself to take yourself out of your comfort zone. And 99.9% of the time, that concern that I might say something inappropriate or foolish or make a fool of myself never, ever happens. So in a way, it's about just even if it's one observation or an insight you provide, that starts you off on the journey. The other thing is about having good facilitators in meetings who observe who the introverts are and bring them in and find a space where they're able to have a voice. It's so important that it's so important that, you know,
and that's having emotional intelligence.
Well, that's having emotional intelligence again. Yeah, exactly. And just being cognizant that so many of these introverts are, as I said earlier, are just so full of brilliant ideas and insights. It's just finding a mechanism to be able to support them in getting that voice out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I remember being at university, in lectures, and whenever the lecturer would ask a question, it was always some big mouth like me who'd stick his hands up and answer it, when there was lots of people who were probably much better than me and knew the answer much better than me. They just kept quiet, and didn't get the credit for answering the question. So, it's definitely important, and everyone's got value and things to add, and they should be brought into the meetings. And I think their lives could benefit enormously if they had the confidence to do that.
Well, I'll give you an example, Frazer. So I'm doing a master's at the moment at Henley Business School, and the first module is on executive coaching, and there's 30 other delegates, all of which are highly talented, very experienced. I mean, combination of CEOs, coaches, trainers, senior execs. I mean, an amazing group of people. And part of the process is kind of coaching in small groups, but occasionally one of the facilitators, all three facilitators, highly experienced coaches in their own right, will ask for a volunteer to participate in an exercise. And that, for me, of course, is my idea of absolute hell, particularly given it's, you're often dealing with very emotional situations. And they asked for a volunteer, and it was sort of lull amongst the 30. And I found myself putting my hand up purely because I couldn't cope with the discomfort of this long silence. And it ended up being, it was an extraordinarily emotional experience, and it was extremely challenging to participate in. And I ended up in floods of tears and having to access some very, very deep-rooted stuff that probably I've never accessed before, at the same time having 30 people staring at me.
Wow.
But it was one of the most extraordinarily liberating things I've ever done, without a shadow of a doubt. And B, and this is complete testament to the other delegates, but 4 or 5 people came up to me the following day saying that watching that very challenging exercise had been a bit of a game changer for the rest of the group, and had created a completely different cohesion and atmosphere in the group dynamic, and said, I just wanted to say thank you for being brave. And I would historically never in a million years have put my hand up.
No, I've been in situations like that myself, and it is extraordinary. If you can just find the courage to share things like that in a group situation, and realize that, you only see other people superficially. Everyone looks like they're, maybe got these perfect lives, and they're all very competent and confident and what have you. But underneath it all, we all have the same fears and insecurities. And when you share that with other people, the reason it resonated so much and changed the dynamic is probably because they all felt similar things.
Oh, completely. And were really thankful that I'd had the courage to put my hand up.
Absolutely. Well done you.
Yeah.
Done you. Now, one of the modules in your, I've seen an outline of your proposed online program that I know you're putting together at the moment. I know one of the modules in that deals with conflict. Now, conflict is something that is unavoidable in life. It frequently crops up in everyone's life to some degree or other. Some people seem to attract it and thrive off it, but most people don't. They either run away from conflict, which isn't probably advisable in lots of cases, but it's an unpleasant thing to have to deal with, probably because of the way people deal with it. But it's a natural thing to encounter conflict. So when you do encounter it, how do you deal with it in a pleasant way? without allowing other people just to walk, without just giving in and allowing other people to walk all over you?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and we could probably spend an hour mulling over this subject. I mean, it's often framing what the perceived conflict is, and a lot of it boils down to the emotional state we allow ourselves to get into. And I'm a great advocate of developing one's assertiveness and understanding the difference between being assertive versus being aggressive. And often in business, the two get confused. And the fundamental difference, I would say, is assertiveness. If we had a kind of spectrum of on the one hand, courage, and also on the other hand, a sort of ability to have consideration for the audience. When it comes to being assertive, it's high courage, but high consideration, which actually makes it very collaborative. Aggression is high courage, but low consideration. It's about what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so often what happens is if somebody goes into an emotional state, being emotional rather than emotionally connected, they can suddenly become very aggressive, and we can unconsciously mirror that. And either we completely back down or it escalates very quickly. So a big part of what we teach when it comes to difficult conversations, conflict resolution, is about understanding the different personality traits other people go into, but also how we respond and what we have to do to keep ourselves in what we refer to as adult. And when you're an adult, it's about developing empathy, listening skills. So often when somebody's angry, it's because they feel like they're not being heard.
No, I can
It's
relate.
amazing just by acknowledging that you understand the other person's feeling something is a really powerful way of kind of taking out a lot of that aggression and stress.
Yeah.
And so big part of it is recognizing behaviors in yourself and other people, but also again just knowing what to do so that you're not a pushover. You access that assertive version of you, but you do it always in a collaborative way. I don't know. Does that sort of answer?
No, I think that's very sage advice indeed, and it's something that once you're aware of it, it's really is something you have to practice, I think.
Yeah.
And
by the way, I think really important, I am awful at conflict resolution when I'm with my kids. I need to caveat that. I can do it reasonably well at work, but it's very difficult when I'm with kids because they trigger me.
Yeah, they trigger. It's the same with my wife. They just trigger, or my father. They just trigger certain things.
Yeah. So it's a lot easier to be in the context of work rather than at home. But again, interestingly, when I apply what I teach to my own kids, it's amazing the difference.
Yeah,
I can imagine. It really does work. It's just remembering to do it when you're dealing with teenagers.
And not letting the steam come out of your ears. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Now, being persuasive and being able to persuade people to your point of view is a critical skill in life and in business. And I know there are certain techniques you can use to become more persuasive when you are talking or giving a presentation. But do you think there's an argument that if you are consciously using certain techniques to be persuasive, it strays into possibly being regarded as being manipulative?
Yes. I mean, there's a difference between sort of manipulative persuasion and ethically sound persuasion, undoubtedly. Again, I mean, I would like to think, and certainly what I'm encouraging clients to access a level of a persuasive version of them that is fueled by good intent. So, I mean, of course, there were lots of shady sales folk out there who are very persuasive and trying to get people to do stuff that's not really in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
But assuming that what you're trying to get the person to do is in their interest or is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Are you providing equal value?
Yeah. Then I think, again, for me, persuasion, I mean, the key to being persuasive is being passionate about what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And finding a way of being able to create, again, that connection with the audience and moving away from, to give you an example. So pretty much every holiday as a family we've ever been on has come off the back of somebody describing their holiday in a really persuasive way.
Yeah.
Now, it's unlikely if I'm down the pub and a mate of mine says, "Oh my God, we've just been to the most amazing place. We got in a cab, we got in a plane, we got in a cab the other end, we went to the hotel, we swam 38 times." Do you know what I mean? I mean, if people just listed out the features of what they did and where they'd been, well, the chances of persuading anybody is absolutely negligible. But if somebody says, we stayed in the most amazing hotel and it was right in the middle of a rainforest and there were the most incredible sound, when somebody gets passionate about and descriptive about what they're saying and going back to that story, then you find yourselves visualizing it and go, "Oh, I want to go there."
Absolutely. So moving on to, people haven't really been doing networking so much over the last few years. It's just they're getting back into it again. And I know a lot of people, myself included, can be quite reticent about networking. And I know my issue with it is I often feel, you're making polite conversation or small talk with people, and it's all very superficial and not really making any sort of genuine connection. And that's, I think, what I find so uncomfortable about it and find it rather dull. But I understand there are things you can do and techniques you can use or methods you can use to overcome that and kind of make a genuine connection with people and have a more relaxed conversation with them. And importantly, if you're trying to networking for business, create a memorable first impression so people want to get back in contact with you. What kind of tips would you give for building that rapport with people and making that connection?
Yeah, well, let me ask you, what is it about networking? And by the way, I'm firmly in the camp of don't like it, but what is it about networking that you find difficult?
It's, as I say, it's just that slightly stilted conversation where you're slightly wary that you always get a few people that are just trying to ram what they do down your throat and sell you straight away, and that's always a bit uncomfortable. I guess I don't want to be perceived as just talking to people because I want their business, and there's always an element of that, so that makes it perhaps slightly uncomfortable.
Yeah, just holding that point because it's really interesting.
It's just not a natural situation, really, to kind of not forcibly, but artificially be meeting people in a kind of regulated environment. So
on that point, because it's really interesting, and I relate completely to what you're saying. I think what we tend to do is immediately ask the person what they do, and we go straight into work. And then very quickly, it sounds like we're trying to sell to somebody, which puts people off immediately. Whereas the most enjoyable networking events I've been to is when I haven't even mentioned work. I've just gone and met some interesting people, and we've had a connection. And my biggest advice would be steer it away from work.
Yeah.
Find ways of, it goes back to that word curiosity. Be interested. Find out who the person is, what makes them click. As soon as you find you've got some commonality, it's amazing how suddenly there is a part of your brain that goes, I'd like to work with this person. I'd like to see if there's a way that I could work with this person. But if you go straight into talking about work, and puffing out your chest and talking about, and sort of trying to sell yourself and outdo the other person, then you just put each other off it instantaneously.
Absolutely. I always make a point. So I purposely never start talking about myself. I just ask them questions about what, them and what they're doing.
You have to, it's a really interesting point, Frazer. You just have to be mindful that you don't end up interrogating the person.
Oh, yeah.
No, but you say that, but it's amazing how people building rapport will do that. So, you get onto the top of the holiday. So where did you go? So who were you with? What was so what I would always say is you've got to find a sort of 50-50 balance of curiosity, asking questions, but also being very comfortable disclosing about you as well.
Mm.
So rapport building should be 50% talking, 50% listening. Absolutely.
So that's great. Now, I know another one of your models, it's not just about public speaking as well. We all communicate via email. I can still remember back in, it must have been around the year 2000, where we just started using email. It was like this, this fantastic new thing, emailing my friends and stuff, and it was incredible. You could send these messages so quickly. These days it's commonplace, but there's a definite tendency amongst people to dash off emails quickly. And I think I've been guilty of this myself on numerous occasions, perhaps saying things in a way that can be read the wrong way, or just appearing abrupt. Now, clearly that's not great for building relationships, or, if you're not communicating what you want to say effectively, or other people thinking you're being rude. I know one of your modules deals with effective business writing. Why do you think emails have that tendency to often appear rude or abrupt, and how can you prevent it from happening?
Well, it's a combination of things. I think often the tone we intended gets misinterpreted. So often we might be being a bit cheeky, or having a bit of fun, or the other person takes it as a literal response, and I've had situations where I've, in my head, emailed somebody. I mean, it couldn't have been more obvious that I was having a bit of fun, and got quite a curt response back. And I've suddenly had to call them up and go, "Whoa, God, I'm so sorry." Yeah. So you just have to be extremely cognizant of the fact that people will interpret stuff in a very different way. But again, it also comes down to relevance. It's about knowing the audience. So, if I'm speaking to a member of my team, I mean, I'm endlessly being ribbed about the fact that I might just respond yes or no, or 3 words, because I know them so well. They understand that we don't have to do the niceties bit. But if you take that less is more approach to too much of a degree with people that don't have that awareness of who you are, then it can be interpreted again as being too curt, dismissive. So you really have to, again, think about who's my audience, how will they read this? If, again, you are responding to someone else's email and they've been curt or challenging, you know what it's like. You just respond in a state of absolute rage, and occasionally you just go send, and you go, that'll show you. And then 30 seconds later you go, oh my God, what have I done?
I know.
I've
really learned not to do that anymore.
But it's easy to do it. So I always say, it can be very cathartic to write it out. But make sure their email isn't, you haven't written in their email.
Write it in Word where it can't be.
Write it in Word, exactly. And then go and have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and come back an hour later and go, do I still think it's appropriate to send this now? And 9 times out of 10, you will go, no. Thank the Lord I didn't. Yeah.
You never regret not sending it, ever.
Exactly.
Hugo, it's been a real pleasure. I think it's been jam-packed full of really, really useful information for people. Your website, I believe, is hugosimpson.com.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's where people can find out more about your online program or make inquiries for their company if they want to do training for people in their company. But that's been fantastic. Just before we go, one final question. Is there a particular book that you could recommend, or place where people can go to learn more about public speaking?
I mean, there are, the honest truth, Frazer, there are hundreds of great books, and often I will create a little library and recommend a library of recommendations for people. There's a particular TED talk that I love that isn't directly correlated to giving a great presentation, but going back to that emotional intelligence piece. And it's all about vulnerability. And it's by an amazing woman called Brené Brown.
Oh, I know her. Yep.
And I just think she is extraordinary. And I think a way of being able to really access the self and that vulnerable part of us, which I think is so important, I would really recommend it.
Okay, so Brené Brown's TED talk on is it on vulnerability?
I think it is on vulnerability. I can't remember. I think, I mean, if you put Brené Brown vulnerability, it'll come up. But I think it's a great example of brilliant delivery and amazing content.
Fantastic. Well, it's been great. Lovely speaking with you, and have a great weekend.
Great seeing you, Frazer. Bye-bye.